Welcome, everyone. Welcome. This is the first session of How Poskim Come to Know Reality with Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. Just a few words about our class. All psak depends on the intersection of theoretical law and reality. As poskim are not trained as doctors, programmers, lawyers, businessmen, farmers, etc., they need to integrate information from outside experts or develop personal expertise. As the world changes, this is even more complicated. The question of how poskim do this is of critical importance. For example, when faced with a simple question of whether one is sick enough to eat on Yom Kippur, does the posek consult his or her own doctors, or trust the patient to find the doctor or assess the situation his or herself? What about political questions? Does the fact that both the laity and poskim can access information with AI and information technology change the equation? We will draw on insights from Eric Topol and Martin Gurri, I hope I'm pronouncing the names correctly, as how this dynamic plays out in medicine and in general for insights. And Rabbi Ziring here with us is the Rosh Yeshiva of Migdal HaTorah in Modi'in. He studied at Yeshivat Har Etzion and continued his learning there as a member of the Kollel Gavoa. He was also a fellow of the Tikva Fund and Center for Modern Torah Leadership, Summer Beit Midrash. Rabbi Ziring was previously served as Sgan Rosh Kollel of the Yeshiva University, Torah Mitzion Bet Midrash Zichron Dov, and as the rabbinic assistant of Beit in Toronto. He has taught in many contexts in the US and Canada and in Israel, focusing particularly on the halachic process. He's also the author of Torah in a Connected World, a halachic perspective on communication technology and social media. And it was published by Magid Books and imprint of Korah in Jerusalem in 2024. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Ziring.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be back. So I'm very excited about this. A little bit of background how we got here. Evie read some of it from the description, but it's what we're going to be talking about. So about a year ago, there's a topic that's been on my mind for a long time. And that is the question of how poskim come to know reality, as the title of this series. And about a year ago, a little bit more, I reached out to Rabbi Aryeh Clapper. Hi, Deborah. How are you? Good to see you. Deborah's wife, Deborah's husband, and I asked him if he wanted to co-write an article on this topic because I had some newer thoughts on the topic. So we sat down to start to write, and at some point I turned to him and I said, this is becoming a book. It's like 70,000 words. So this is something that's been interesting me for a long time, and I thought about a lot. And I want to share some of what we've been doing. So a little bit of background. Then I'll open it to you, and then we'll look at some sources. So as Evie read from the introduction, psak, the decision-making of halacha, just like any legal system, has two main components. There's the theoretical law component, right? You need to figure out the parameters of the statute, who it applies to, when it applies, and the like. And halacha, there's its own complexity as to how you figure that out. We balance analysis. For those of you who have been with me in the past, I've talked about this in several series, but you start with the primary sources, the Torah, the Talmud, and the like, and you analyze those texts. You assess precedent, and you look how previous interpreters have understood the law. You look at custom and understand the lived practice of Jews. And when you combine all of those in whatever way a given halachic authority combines them, you come up with the theoretical law, the law on the books, right? So if you open up any code of Jewish law, whether that be the Rambam, whether that be Shulchan Aruch, whether that be a modern contemporary work in Hebrew or in English, there will be a theoretical law that's there. Basics like if you have a meat stew and you accidentally spill a little bit of milk into the stew. So then it depends. Is there 60 times the meat than there is the milk? Things like that, right? The theoretical law, the laws of Shabbat, the laws of Brachot, the laws of whatever it might be. That's the theoretical law. But practical law has another very, very important step. And that is that you need to apply the theoretical law to the reality. And that is much, much easier said than done. And that's true for a number of reasons. That's true because sometimes the reality is hard to assess. But even more fundamentally, the reason that it's hard, it's particularly hard for halachic authorities, is that halachic authorities, rabbis, poskim, any expert in Jewish law has to be, by definition, trained in the classical texts and methodologies of Jewish law. But since halacha can apply to any aspect of life, there's a very good chance that they're not trained in the facts, right? In the discipline that is necessary to understand the facts. To take a very simple example, can you use a dishwasher for meat and milk, either at the same time, which is the position of Rabbi Yosef, or one after the other, which is the position of Rav Moshe Feinstein? That question hangs on a series of halachic questions that have to do with the transference of taste, the relevance of soap in the dishwasher. Does that destroy the taste particles and prevent them from mixing, prevent the meat from mixing with the milk? Does it destroy the taste particles? What is the temperature of the water? Is it above the magic point of Yad Saledidbo, where it burns your hand, and therefore it can transfer taste, and has the halachic status of cooking? Is it below that? All those are halachic issues. But equally important is the reality, right? So if a posek were to say that you're allowed to use the same dishwasher for meat and milk if the water does not rise to the temperature of Yad Saledidbo. So there's the legal side of it, where he makes that statement, he determines that the relevant temperature is whatever it is, and there's a range of positions from like 47 degrees, 45, 47 degrees Celsius to like 70 degrees Celsius. But then there's the simple reality of figuring out, well, what is the temperature in the dishwasher? Can you rely on the temperature that it says on the button? Right, on mine it says that one of them is 45 degrees Celsius. Can you rely on that? Many poskim distinguish between dishwashers that have a round of which cleans without soap and is just water, and dishwashers that don't. So how are you supposed to know that that's true? You need to know, you need to be an expert in the ins and outs of the dishwasher. You need to know the engineering behind it to be able to answer these questions. And as much as a rabbi might know all the theoretical legal questions, they can't weigh in on the halachic parameters of using the dishwasher if they can't answer these factual questions. But, and this should not be surprising to anybody, when you study for smicha, when you study to be a rabbi, when you study in yeshiva, there are not extensive courses on the construction and functioning of dishwashers. So it's very nice for someone to write a theoretical legal work and say something like, if you have a dishwasher that does X, Y, and Z, so then you can use it in such and such a way. But it's a very different question for them to be able to say with conviction that the dishwasher you have in front of you is that type of dishwasher. And pretty much every question you will ever have in halacha has that problem, has that tension, that in order to apply theoretical law to the world, you need to understand the world. If you're dealing with a medical halachic question, then you need to understand the medical background. And rabbis are not trained as doctors. If you are weighing in on, if you're weighing in on Shabbat questions that have to do with agriculture, then you probably need to understand the agriculture. And most rabbis are not trained in farming. And it goes on and on. And therefore, it is really, really important to try to understand how do poskim come to know reality? Because when someone weighs in on a halachic question, they usually actually say, you are allowed to do this. You are not allowed to do this. This is how you do this. This is how you don't do this. And that is making a factual claim, right? In addition to the legal claim, they're weighing in. Right? And again, the example that Evie read, as we'll see, is one of the classic texts. Everybody agrees that if somebody's life will be endangered if they don't eat on Yom Kippur, they're allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. That is a very easy halachic statement. But as I'm sure many of you know, the days before Yom Kippur, every halachic authority's phone is ringing constantly with someone saying, am I allowed to eat on Yom Kippur? Because the devil is in the details, right? It's easy to say that if your life is in danger, if you fast, you're allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. The challenge isn't to say that. The challenge is to figure out, is someone's life in danger? And that is a medical question. And in order to answer the halachic question, you need to somehow figure out a framework to incorporate the facts. And that's not so simple because you have a lot of options in front of you. You can talk to the patient's doctor. The rabbi can have his own go-to doctor. The rabbi can do independent research and read the most up-to-date articles in the I don't know, New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA or whatever the case may be, and come to his own conclusions. Those are all theoretical options, but it's clear that you need to somehow come to an answer. So what I want to do over the next 4 weeks is try to set up a framework to figure out how do poskim come to incorporate reality. So that's our goal for the next 4 weeks. And I really would love feedback because, as I said, Ray Clapper and I are trying to finalize a draft of a book on this topic. And, this is a chance for me to get feedback on whether these ideas resonate, whether we missed something in our analysis, and the like. Okay, with that, I will open it up to you for initial thoughts before we start looking at sources. And again, I want to acknowledge that Deborah is here, who is Ray Clapper's wife, who's writing with me, and my mother is here as well. So welcome, and my mother-in-law. So welcome to everybody. Okay, initial thoughts before we look at the sources. Okay, if not, then we will. Then wait, I see there are comments. No, that's the sources.
I think
Sorry,
Richard,
I raised my hand.
Richard, go ahead.
Oh,
yeah,
raise
you
it.
can feel free to just unmute and speak.
Yeah, you can just unmute and talk. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. So I guess, so first of all, thank you for doing this. Looking forward very much to the class. I guess my two very initial thoughts are when you talk about two things that an authority has to do when they poskin, I would have thought that the third thing they need to do is consider the individual in front of them, their level of observance, their level of commitment, how scared they are. So, for example, your Yom Kippur eating question, there may be a doctor issue, but there may be an emotional side. So I'd be sort of curious how that gets integrated as well. But if that's not really the focus of your class, that's okay. But just
so you are definitely right. Let me talk about that for 2 minutes. So you are correct, right? I have this. I've shared it in the past. I don't know if I can find it this second. A one image I have of all the different factors of psak, but you're right. Really, the way I talk about psak in general is that first you figure out the theoretical law in an ideal situation, then you would try to apply it to the factual reality, and then you're right that the third component that I have is you assess, if this is a normal situation or whether it has extenuating circumstances, because psak in extenuating circumstances is different. You're definitely right. For our purpose, I would say that actually integrates into what we're talking about, right? Because to take your example, the if someone's going to eat on Yom Kippur, there's what's classically understood as medical issues, and I hope to talk about mental health probably in week 3 because it's a very good example of the complexity here. But I'll just sort of talk about it a little bit now. Let's say you have a posek who recognizes that someone's life can be in danger. However, that's understood halachically, not just from physical illness, but from mental illness as well. So there, the posek now has to do multiple things, but they still integrate into our broader question. They need to assess that there's a mental health problem, right? And they need a framework for assessing what that even means, right? Now, it may be that they're not talking to a GP, they're talking to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but the challenge for that extenuating circumstance, and especially mental health is a classic example where it creates extenuating circumstances, but it just creates yet another complexity where the rabbi needs to integrate information that he's not an expert in. So you're 100% right, but it only highlights how hard this question is, because if you introduce mental health in halacha, right now you could have, let's say, the rabbi, the GP, right, and the psychiatrist. And now you got to figure out, so how exactly do you negotiate all these pieces? Do you give the final word to the GP? Do you give the final word to the rabbi and he weighs the information? Do you give it to the mental health professional? Do you give it to the patient to incorporate all the data, right? So the mental health component only highlights exactly how complicated this is. But you're right, probably more precisely, and this is how I generally do it. If I don't know if I can find it this second, but if I can, I'll maybe take a minute and try to pull up my this one graphic. But yes, the extenuating circumstances dictates that you can apply the theoretical law differently than you would in an ideal situation. But that usually, because the assessment that you're in an extenuating circumstance is a factual claim and a legal claim. It's right the intersection of fact and law. So it also comes down to this question: is how do you assess that? Right? How do you assess someone's state of mind, and how do you assess the implications of someone's state of mind on halacha? So you're 100% right, and that's why we are going to talk about mental health specifically, because I think it is one of the areas in which this challenge is most pronounced. So yes, it is totally on topic, but and I do hope I'm thinking week 3 at this point is when we'll talk about that. Because I do think that the history of mental health and halacha over the last 100+ years is a great test case for the way Poskim think about these issues. Okay, anyone else? So thank you, Richard. Anyone else want to initial thoughts before we look at the sources?
Yeah, hi. I wanted
Hi.
to mention that when you mentioned that we don't have the reality if someone wants to be posek something and then perhaps they're not doctors, they're not agriculture people, but today we have the internet where use with caveat, make sure that AI is not just stop making things up. We can become not experts, but we can get a good understanding of the practical aspect of farming, let's say. So I think that changes a bit of the reality for a rabbi's posek.
1,000%, and I'm not sure if that's going to be week 3. Probably that'll be week 4, the final week. But that was actually what prompted me to start writing now. Was, as we're going to see, that yes, I'm going to focus just for illustration, specifically on the work of Eric Topol, who's a fascinating writer. In general, he's a medical futurist. Or I think that's what they refer to him as. He's a cardiologist. But he's written a tremendous amount on the way that AI has, technology in general, but most recently AI has shifted the balance between patient and doctor, because patients have access to more information and doctors have limits on their own knowledge, and how we should rethink patient care, or the balance of power in the doctor-patient relationship. And that was really what prompted me, was to ask the question, as you are, is does modern technologies, and in many ways specifically AI, shift the balance? And again, I'm sort of giving away some of week 4, but that's okay. Does in the case of a halachic question, the rabbi is taking the role of patient, right? Except it's not their health they're worried about, it's the halacha, right? They're talking to the doctor. It's the same dynamic, right? There's the doctor providing the medical knowledge, and the posek is the patient. Does the fact that AI has changed the way patients approach their own care and the ownership they take of their own care, does that reflect the way Poskim should take ownership over research? So that is where I hope to get to in week 4, probably. I'm playing around with the weeks depending on how questions go, but you should know, yes, that is what drove me to think about it in the current moment, is that shift of AI specifically, right? Because Google was one thing, AI is a different ball game in that way, especially because its potential in diagnostics, right, and not just information gathering, totally changed the equation. And so especially for medical halachic issues, AI is a game changer that way. So yes, 100%. That is the chapter that I am probably proudest of in the entire book, was the work I did on that point. So I'm looking forward to see how people react to my particular take on it. Okay. Any other initial questions or comments or insights or anything? Okay. So let me open the sources here. But before I get into the, let's say, hard sources here, I included a more comical source here, and this is from one of my Rabbi NYU, who tells the following story in an article called "On Gizzards and the Making of Rabbis" by Rabbi Ezra Schwartz. So he says there's a well-known story variously retold as having occurred with Reb Baruch Ber Leibowitz, the Rosh Hashiva of Kamenetz, and the Mittler Rebbe of Chabad. Whoever it was, he happened to be in an abattoir and asked what a particular animal organ was. He was told that it was a gizzard, a kurkavan, right? And there's a ridiculous amount of halachic literature written about the gizzard, the kurkavan. Overtaken with emotion, the gadol blurted out, "The heilige kurkavan, the holy gizzard." The rabbi had delivered many shiurim involving the intricacies of hilchot treifot, and had spoken often of a pin found in a kurkavan. Now, for the first time, he saw an actual kurkavan. Right? So, Rabbi Schwartz tells this story, which has been told, as he notes, about many rabbis, that there are many rabbis who they spend their life dealing with theoretical law, but they spend their entire life talking about the kurkavan, but they have no idea what a gizzard looks like. So if you ask them a theoretical question, they could tell you what the law is if a pin is found in a gizzard, but if you showed them a gizzard, they have no idea whether it's kosher or not, because they don't know what a gizzard looks like. That type of person might give a great shiur in yeshiva. That person doesn't make a good posek. Right? That person doesn't make a good posek. And what's true of the kurkavan is true of everything, right? Back to our examples. A posek who doesn't know anything about dishwashers can't poskin about dishwashers. A posek who doesn't know anything about medicine can't poskin on medicine, etc., etc. So what is a posek to do? So what I want to do today is just analyze 4.5 models of what a posek can do. So the first source, and this is one we've already alluded to, is the classic text about eating on Yom Kippur. And it's the source that I'll call the outsourcing source. Okay? So the Mishnah in Yoma tells you, Ubra shehiricha, if you have a pregnant woman who smells food and comes to desire that food, right? And therefore, there's a risk to her health, to the fetal health. The halacha is machilin otat shetashiv nasha. The theoretical law is very clear. she can eat. We give her food until she is better. Chole, a sick person, ma'achilan oto al pi bikiyin. We feed them based on expert opinion. Vim ein sham bikiyin, and if there is no expert, there's no doctor, ma'achilan oto al pi atzmo ad sheyomar dai. So we let the patient eat until they say, I'm done. I've eaten enough. Okay? So I call this the outsourcing model. What is the relationship here between the rabbi representing the theoretical law and the medical data, right? How is the rabbi in this Mishnah said to come up with the medical information that they need to figure out whether a sick person or a pregnant woman can eat on Yom Kippur? What do they do, right? What model emerges from this text?
You go according to the patient.
To
In
the
other
patient
words,
or
at tafshid nafsha,
right?
and
So either the patient or the doctor, right? Al pi
well,
bikiyin, right? If there's a doctor, you go by the doctor. If there's not the doctor, patient.
But aren't there situations where if there are doctors that go against what the person himself who's sick feels,
Sure.
that we go according to that person, not the doctors?
Yes. I cut out all the complexity. I just the basic text. But you're right. What happens when there's a tension? But if we just highlight the just what's here in the original source, I think the best way of characterizing it, as I said, is outsourcing. Is that there's a recognition that psak, halachic decision making, has two factors: the theoretical law, and what's the theoretical law in this case? That if a person's life is in danger if they don't eat, they can eat. Right? That's the theoretical law. That's the realm of the rabbi. And then there's the fact component. Is the person's life in danger? And how does the rabbi come to determine the facts that are relevant? He outsources.
But there's an extra level here of somebody decided that for the pregnant woman, you don't go to a baki, you go straight to her. Whereas for a challah,
no, well, it's not totally clear. Tashiv nafsha, you're right. But presumably that's because at some point someone made a medical decision that a pregnant woman who needs food, right? You're right. And this is part of the complexity, is that at some point someone made a medical assertion. Maybe we don't have to make that assertion right now in this local case because someone made it in the past. And then you got to figure out who made that. Anne's totally right. But what strikes me about this text is that, on the one hand, the reality of that halacha applies to is clearly part of the psak. But the way we come to know it is by outsourcing, right? The rabbi, there's no indication in the simple read of the text that the rabbi has any say in determining the reality, right? From this text, we have no idea, right? There is an expert. Now, obviously, this text is much more complicated than it seems because this text speaks as if there is one body of experts and they are unanimous, right? The text does not tell us what you do if there is a dispute amongst experts. It doesn't tell you what if there's an argument about who the experts are. It doesn't tell you if there are different experts that are relevant, right? As was mentioned before by Richard, of medical experts and mental health experts. None of that. We have no idea. All we know is that the Mishnah assumes that there are two components to this question. There's the theoretical legal question, and there's the medical question, and the rabbi outsources the medical information, medical determination, to a combination of doctors and or patients. That's what we know. That's it. Yes, Richard.
But there is an intriguing differentiation here, which is if you have a standard chola, then as you say, it's outsourced either to the chola or to an expert, but the expert doesn't really need to consult the rabbi, just says, yeah, they need to eat in order to live, and that's a fairly easy standard, and the experts figure it out. But what's interesting is with the pregnant women, it would seem that the rabbis are presuming that a pregnant woman automatically is in this pikuach nefesh state and needs to eat, either because psychologically, she can't bear it, or because physically her body needs it.
Right.
And so the intriguing question there is, did the rabbis actually talk to doctors, whatever experts they had back in those days, and say, hey, let's understand pregnant women so that we can create a default rule and never have to consult? Or did the rabbis just invent this standard on their own because their own wives were pregnant, and so they just sort of figured it out on their own? Or did they go to experts to create this default rule for pregnant women?
Good. So Richard seconds what Anne said before, which is that, yeah, by the pregnant woman, there seems to be like a background medical assumption, and we don't even know if that assumption was made by doctors in the past or rabbis in the past, or a combination of rabbis or doctors in the past. We actually have no idea. We don't know. But to typify it, let's call this model 1, right? This is the outsourcing model, that the way we figure it out is the rabbis provide the law, the poskim provide the law, somebody else, the experts, whoever they are, we don't know who they are, there's a lot of complexity in that, but they determine the facts. Okay, that's model 1. Let's look at the next model. And the next model is, in many ways, even more extreme. Okay? Evie, can you just move down the sources here? Okay. The next part is what I'll call the facts are not part of psak. Right? Facts are not part of psak. Now, what do I mean by that? So, the Mishnah tells the following. It's talking about a woman whose husband has disappeared. He went on the classic case in the Mishnah is he went on a journey by ship, and he hasn't returned home. So we don't know whether he's alive or dead. And the Mishnah is trying to figure out, well, what happens if she gets remarried? So the Mishnah says, if she married without consent of the court, but based on testimony, so muteret lachzor lo, she can return to her first husband. The fact that in the interim she had remarried, that is not considered adultery, so it doesn't forbid her to her first husband. Nisid al pi beitin, if she marries based on the ruling of the court, teitze. So obviously when the husband comes back, it turns out that she was still married to the first husband, so she has to get divorced. But p'tura min hakarban, she's not held personally liable for the sin of adultery because she followed the ruling of the court, who told her she was allowed to remarry. Lo nised al pi beitin, if she got married without having gotten permission from the court, teitze, she has to divorce the second husband because, again, her first husband is still alive, i.e., her husband is still alive. V'chayevet be karban, and she is liable to a karban. Yafe koach beitin, the power of the court is powerful because shepotra min karban, it exempts her from bringing a karban if it turns out that she remarried when she was actually still married. And harua beitin linaseh, if the court said she can get married, which obviously implies that they think her husband is dead, but she went and she did not get remarried. She went and had a relationship outside the confines of marriage. Halcha v'kilkila chayevet b'karban. So then she is liable to a karban. She is liable to an offering because she unwittingly engaged in adultery, and she didn't have the imprimatur of the court, because the court had told her she could get married. The court didn't tell her that she could have a relationship outside of marriage. Okay, that Mishnah is fascinating, but it's only the background to the key source, which the Gemara brings up a little bit later. So Evie, if you could just go down here to the next source. So the Gemara on Sadi Bet, on 92 there, brings the following case. Amar nisid al beitin teitze. Amar Ziring. Leta lematniten miditnan beit midrasha. We don't accept this Mishnah because of the following Braita. The Tani Be Midrasha, and this Rabbi Clapper likes saying is the most dangerous text in all of the Talmud. And you'll see why in just a second. Horu Beitin Sheshaka Chama. If the court says it is Shabbat and the sun has set, Ulibasof Zarcha, and then it turns out that it was not, Shabbat was not over, it was a cloudy day. So the sun comes out. So the people went home, they made Havdalah, they, I don't know, right? The rabbis said in shul, Shabbat is over, go home and make Havdalah and come back. Parent-child learning with pizza and raffles is at 6:30, right? Looking forward to seeing you. Everyone went home, made Havdalah. They're being, as halachically committed as they can. The rabbis told them to go home, make Havdalah, and come back to learn with their children. And it turns out the sun, it was just really, really, really cloudy. And the sun peeks out of the clouds, and they're like, oh no, it is actually still Shabbat afternoon. Ein zu hora'ah ella ta'ut. Ziri says the laity, the people in shul, cannot hide behind the court because there are three types of halachic decisions. There's correct halachic decisions, there's incorrect halachic decisions, and there are halachic decisions that are so disastrously rendered that they are non-decisions. Correct decisions, great. Incorrect decisions, as we saw in the Mishnah, you're allowed to hide behind the court under certain circumstances and say it was a mistake, but it's not my fault. I listened to the rabbis. I listened to the high court. And then there are decisions that are so wrong that they are non-decisions and you can't hide. And Ziri says this is one of them. Right? If they tell you the sun has set and it has not, ein zu hora'ah ella ta'ut. That is not an incorrect decision. It is a non-psak. Rav Nachman disagrees. Rav Nachman says horahi amar. Rav Nachman teded the horahi d'v'chol kulei echad lo mehemen v'acha mehemen. He says, I'll prove it to you, because we're talking about the case of the woman who got remarried on the basis of one witness. Generally, one witness is not sufficient. Here it is, which shows you my time Allah mishum de'orahi. So Rav Nachman introduces the following interesting claim, which is the following. There are two things you need to do when you have facts. One is determine the fact. The second is the standard of evidence that you need. So to take an example in American law, let's say you have evidence that someone committed a crime, but it rises to the level of the preponderance of the evidence, but it doesn't rise to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt. So in American law, that means that it is admissible for civil law and inadmissible for criminal law. If the question of whether something rises to the standard of the preponderance of the evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt is plausibly a legal question and not a factual question, right? Because everyone agrees that, let's say you have 80% certainty. The question of whether 80% counts as the preponderance of the evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt is a legal question of how to assess 80% certainty. So Rav Nachman says, listen, in this case, there's really two things going on. There's the question of whether the husband is dead and the question of whether we were legally allowed to assume that the husband was dead based on the evidence that we had. But as fascinating as Rav Nachman's question is, I'm going to focus for now on Ziri, because the Talmud seems to conclude like Ziri, that Amar Rabba teded the Ta'udu and goes on that it's an error. So let's focus on Ziri. And let's leave the marriage case and let's just take the Shabbat case, because even those who reject Ziring in the marriage case seem to accept him in the Shabbat case. What does the Gemara imply by saying that if the Beit Din says the sun has set and it has not, that it is a non-psak, right? It's just a non-psak. It's not a mistaken psak. It's a non-psak, right? What does that tell us or imply about the relationship between halachic decisors, halachic authorities, and facts? So, right, Clapper likes pointing out that the simple read of the Talmud here is that facts are just not part of psak. They're just not part of it. Obviously, halacha needs to apply to the real world, but facts are not something that poskim, that rabbis have authority over. So, let's contrast Model 1 and Model 2. Right? Model 1 says that the question of whether a person is sick enough to eat on Yom Kippur is a halachic data point, but it's a halachic data point which is outsourced to experts. But presumably, once the experts weigh in, the fact pattern becomes part of the halachic decision. Model 2 implies that that's not even true. That when it comes to facts, the facts are just the things to which halacha applies. But if you ask me whether it actually becomes part of the law, the answer is no. And therefore, in principle, who has authority over facts? Nobody, right? Nobody. The facts are what they are. Now, what does that look like in practice? If you take this seriously, that means that if a rabbi tells someone, you are allowed to eat this food because it is, this is beef, right? And the person knows that it's not beef, they knows that it's pork, then it doesn't matter how many rabbis tell the person they can eat this piece of meat, it's just an error, right? Their statement about fact is just error. And not only can you not rely on it, but if someone relies on it, they're held personally liable, because the fact that the rabbi weighed in on what type of meat this is completely irrelevant, because the facts exist, right? The facts exist. It's not about you. You don't get to decide. The facts are. They speak for themselves. So Model 1, again, says the facts seem to be incorporated into halacha, but not by the rabbi. Model 2 says facts at some level, even though obviously they're necessary to make a halachic decision, they remain adjacent to, outside the actual purview of halacha. Halacha applies to them, but they're outside. Rabbi Clapper refers to both of these two models as a posek who takes either model, meaning a posek who says, I don't take responsibility for the facts, go ask your doctor. Or, obviously I don't take a stance on the facts, because facts is just, they are what they are. Go figure it out for yourself. He calls those abdicatory models, right? The rabbi is abdicating authority over the reality. He's abdicating the authority to practically say what the halacha is. Now, Deborah points out in the chat here that maybe, right, and this is what we're going to have to figure out as much as we can over the next 4 weeks, and how much we'll get through, we'll see, is it could be that not all facts are created equal, right? It could be that Model 1 refers to facts that are gray, right? Because medical issues are often not black and white. And in that case, a decision has to be made and it becomes part of halacha, even if the rabbi isn't making it. Whereas the question of whether the sun set or didn't is so black and white that no one can have authority over that. And that's definitely possible. What I want to highlight here so far is just that these are two models. Right? These are two models. They may apply to different situations, right? So, but the common denominator between these two models is that they imagine that poskim are not weighing in on the reality by dint of their authority. Right? In case one, the facts get incorporated into the psak, but we outsource their assessment. Model two, if we take it seriously, says that at some level we don't even incorporate them. They stand outside of the halachic system. We relate to them, but they are impervious to authority. And it could be, as Deborah notes, that it depends what type of information we're dealing with, but the models are still distinct. Okay, Richard, I saw you raise your hand. Yes.
Yeah. So to take your treif meat case, so the rabbi hands you a piece of raw meat and says, "This meat is perfectly fine." You go home and you cook it in your pots, and then the rabbi calls you, or so your neighbor looks and says, that was pork. And the fact is it was pork, but the rabbi told you it was okay to eat. Are your dishes now all treif? And so you have to because the rabbi takes no responsibility for the facts? Is that
so not only
is there a debate
dishes,
here, a machloket here as to how that works?
So there's no debate as to the fact that your dishes are treif. That's clear. What seems to be implied by this text is more than that. You are personally held spiritually liable for that mistake. Meaning you can't even hide behind the fact that your pots are treif is a given. But not just that. Between you and God, you're not okay. You can't blame the rabbi. Right? That's the novelty of the second source, is that you can't hide behind the rabbi, right? Because you'll say, but my rabbi told me. And we'll say, yeah, but so what? It's a factual question, and you could have figured it out yourself, right? You're responsible yourself. The rabbis can't protect you from factual error. So everyone will agree that everything is treif, but it's more than that. You are responsible for that, right? You can't hide behind your rabbi. So model 1 and 2 imply that poskim do not independently determine reality. Either they outsource it or they simply abdicate and say, the facts are what they are. I can tell you what I think they are, but you are responsible to figure out yourself, because fundamentally I can't protect you. At the other extreme, we have the next source. And this is really the combination of many, many, many sources in the Gemara. But I'm just going to read you the Rambam, because the Rambam implies a different model. The Rambam tells you as follows. He's trying to figure out the parameters of the requirements for a court. Yodim ktsat mishar chochmot. They know some of other wisdoms. Kigon rifuot v'cheshbon utkufot mazalot. והצגנינות ודרכי המוננים והקוסמים והמחשבים והבלי עבודה זרה וכיוצא באלו כדי שיהיו יודעים לדון אותם. And they need to know some medicine, some math, some astronomy. They need to know the nature of magic and idolatry so that they can weigh in. Right? So this model, before we get to the extent of it, what is it telling you about how poskim come to know facts? Right? So model 1 is outsource. Model 2 is total abdication. Model 3 is they got to know it. Right? To weigh in on halacha, you need to know the reality. And therefore, if you want to be on a court, then know the reality. Now, it doesn't tell you how much you need to know. It doesn't tell you have to be the world expert. It doesn't tell you have to be competent, conversant. It doesn't tell you whether you need to know enough to talk to experts. We have no idea. All we know is that we've now introduced another possibility, which is that poskim are called upon to develop a level of expertise in the facts. How much? Again, we don't know yet. But we've now introduced a third model, that one of the ways that poskim come to know facts is by becoming independently educated in said facts, right? That is a very, very different model, right? That's a very different model, because what we're saying here is that the way that poskim come to know the facts is not by asking experts. They may train with experts, but when it comes to a specific case, the way that they weigh in is from their own knowledge. And I want to introduce one more text before we leave. So let me at least read it, and then we'll try to bring it together. Why is it that they need to develop some expertise? And again, we'll see next week that there's quite a range on how much expertise we think they need. So that comes down to the next source. The Gemara in Makot tells you, Evie, if you could just scroll down a little bit to 5. Thank you. Says as follows: Rabbi Yos Yamar Lo'olam ein neharagen ad sheyu shnei eidav matrin bo. You can't kill someone until you have witnesses. Shneimar al pi shnai midim. Davar acher, another derivation, is al pi shnai midim shelo tei sanhedrin shomad mipi haturgaman. The court can't hear through the claims of the litigants mediated through a translator. So the Gemara then comments, Davar acher al pi shnai midim shelo tei sanhedrin shomad mipi haturgaman. There were some who spoke a foreign language and came to Rava. Uki Rava Turgaman Benayu, and Rava put a translator between them. Shemar says, how could he have a translator? Vatnan Shalote Sanhedrin Shomad Mi Pia Turgaman. We said courts can't hear claims through a translator. Shemar answers, Rava Mida Vayada Madavu Amre Vahadure Hudala Vayada. The rabbis knew they understood the language. They needed a translator to articulate their opinion back. Now, that source implies, right, that there are cases in which it's okay for poskim to not have extreme expertise. Now, I'm using this more as a parable, but they need to have enough knowledge. And Rabinovich clarifies this. What's the problem with hearing things through a translator? You never know where the translator is telling is accurate, right? Things get lost in translation. And therefore, if the court isn't knowledgeable at all in the language, then they are at the whims of the translator. But on the other hand, they don't need to know every language fluently. What they need to know is enough to understand and not necessarily enough to speak. Now, in expertise, we can talk about this as well. That, let's say in medical knowledge, the equivalent of this would be something like rabbis are conversant enough in medical information that they understand what doctors are telling them, and they know how to get second opinions and understand, but they don't necessarily have to have their own medical opinions. So if I now turn to these two texts, we get a very different model. In these two models, what we get is that poskim come to know facts through independent research and knowledge, and then both because that seems to be important and because a total lack of knowledge creates a translation problem, right? That the halacha or the facts that halacha applies to are being mediated through an outside source, and that is problematic. So to summarize what we've seen so far, it seems to me that these sources are emblematic of different models, and the challenge is to negotiate when they apply. One model tells us that facts are part of halacha but rabbis are totally allowed to abdicate and outsource and say someone else will make the decision, but once they decide it, it becomes part of halacha. Possibility 2 is more extreme and says, no, facts, at least some facts, are so obvious that halacha applies to them, but no one has authority over them. It's every man and every woman for themselves. Model 3 is that poskim need to develop independent expertise. We don't know how much expertise, but they need to develop independent expertise to weigh in on particular issues. And model 3B or 4 is that poskim don't necessarily have to be experts, but they can't be so non-expert that all information that comes to them is mediated through someone and that they're at the whim of that person. The challenge for us is to figure out how these types of models work in psak in general. So I know it's at 8 o'clock, but if I just give you a 30-second example, right? Let's go back to the Yom Kippur case, right? What does this play out in our full models? So the outsourcing model says that the rabbi says, talk to the doctor. Whatever the doctor says is the halacha. The abdication model says, the rabbi says, listen, I have no idea. If your life is in danger, you can eat. If it isn't, you isn't. Who makes that decision? I have no idea. Model 3 would imply that the rabbi says, I know enough medicine that I'm going to independently tell you, I think your life is in danger, you can eat, or I think your life is not in danger and you can't eat. And model 4 would be that a posek says, listen, I've read enough medical literature that I understand the jargon, so I'm going to talk to the doctors, and based on what they tell me, I will incorporate the knowledge in. I'm not going to make the decision myself, but I'm also not going in blind. And what's true of Yom Kippur is true of basically every halachic thing. Any halachic question that we have, the challenge we have over the next few weeks is to play out, what does this actually look like? Like, how much expertise do poskim need? What information do they need? How do they access it? And the like. And how do these 4 models intersect with each other? Because, again, they all are true in some extent. The question is how, when, where, and for whom. I'm over time, so I'll stop there. But again, to reiterate, thank you for everyone for coming. I'm looking forward to discussing these issues and playing them out in more depth in coming weeks. You're free to reach out if you have thoughts during the week. My email's at the top of the source sheet. Thank you, as always, to Evie for organizing. And I'm here if anyone wants the last comments, but you're all free to go because we're over time. But if anyone wants to have more questions, comments, I will stay for a few more minutes. Okay.
Does anyone have any questions or comments? Feel free to unmute now if you want to say anything. Otherwise, we can close for today, and I know that you can email Rabbi Ziring with any questions. I'll give it one more second. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ziring, as always.
Thank you to everyone.
And thank you also to the participants for always being part of our learning community here at Risha. We value each and one of you. And Rabbi Ziring, I'll see you next week. Lehitraot.
See you next week. Lehitraot.
Bye-bye.